The Postal series and Running with Scissors have been hosting their very own game jams, and this year, perhaps foolishly, Postal and myself decided to enter. To cut to the chase, it's out now. You can watch the trailer and play it for free at the link below. But how did we get here? How do you make a game? And what does that process look like when you have almost no prior experience? Join us now on a journey from inception through 2 agonizing months all the way to launch. The theme of the jam centered around the violent video game protesters from Postal 2, so I figured what would be better suited than a tower defense game. In a hyperfocus, I blasted out a tiny design document outlining the game, and within an afternoon, the basic concepts were all there. Protesters are trying to get into the building, build towers that shoot automatically to stop them, upgrade those towers with money, have some power-ups to shake up the gameplay a little. Between the two of us, there was a fairly basic split of duties. I would handle the art because making YouTube thumbnails is a transferable skill, and Postal would code things because he used Unity one time. After a brief discussion about the document and brainstorming some more ideas, we fully committed to making the game. When the jam was announced, I was deep in editing hell, working furiously on the Postal mobile video, which was still over 2 weeks out from its initial release. So right out of the gate, the time we had left took a pretty big hit. Within a few days, the first mechanics came into reality. Placeholder protesters followed a set path and turrets would track them within their radius. Shortly after that, simple shooting mechanics were coded in as well as the game over screen. I started cooking up the general design of the UI as well as the map. Most of the on-screen elements are the same as they are in the final version, but this counter was removed, as we felt that while it did look kinda cool, it didn't add much to the game. Knowing the deadline wasn't that far away, lots of little things like this got discarded to make sure there was ample time to develop and playtest the core game. Another change was to Cracola. Originally, it was supposed to be a powerful upgrade token you could apply to a single tower. Scissors would bounce between targets, machine gunners would equip a cat silencer and have a special attack, as well as the hunting rifle gaining a piercing shot. Unfortunately, these had to be cut, but only because of the constraints we were under. On the topic of things being scrapped, I initially wanted the game to have more of an isometric view, similar to the original Postal, and used screenshots from Postal 2 to make sprites out of the protesters and towers. It soon became apparent that this wasn't going to work for a few reasons. 1. Each entity would need a base sprite for all 8 directions, and then another 8 for any different action they might perform, like towers firing or protesters dying. 2. Projectiles would look inaccurate when leaving the tower. They'd have to move towards the protesters from one of the 8 directional points instead of 360 degrees. 3. This kind of perspective can be difficult to pull off in a 2D game, and it might just end up looking kinda shit. So we switched to a top-down perspective, and despite how much I wanted to use isometric, I'm grateful that we did. For both the art and the code, it made everything more cohesive and a lot simpler to make. Now, the gameplay segment that was cut would have taken place inside the Running with Scissors office between levels. You would have been able to walk around like an old on-rails adventure game and interact with some of the devs to buy power-ups and upgrades.
Hey man, what's up?
Though I still think it's a cool idea that would have been a lot of fun to make and a good opportunity to add more dialogue to the game, I feel that it's best that it was cut.
I don't think so.
The shift in visuals would have been quite jarring and overall may have been a distraction from the main gameplay. With the aesthetic nailed down, I drew up the outline for the map so there was a more defined area of play to work with, and then got started on some of the projectiles, towers, and protesters. The protesters were a bit of a pain, as they went through a few different iterations. I tried a couple of frame-by-frame walking cycles, but was unhappy with the result. Plus, the sign was too large and would have clipped through parts of the map anyway, so it was all canned and redrawn. This is where the other 2 types of protesters were created and thrown into the mix. One that randomly speed boosts an ally for a few seconds, and another that reduces incoming damage nearby. Both variants are named, but that detail and an explanation of what exactly they do didn't make it into the game. I figured it was worth including here, but I also snuck it into the subtitles of the game's trailer. Let's check in with Postal and see how the code is progressing.
Wszystko kurwa facie pierdolony. Kurwa no nie. Nie! Kurwa!
I think this roughly translates to having visual feedback, non-placeable areas, and bullet trails. Next up was the wave design and implementation, which was completely out of my hands, but seems like an extremely laborious process. This was about the time more conceptual ideas were finalized and decided, like having 7 days instead of 5, what days mechanics would be introduced, how tower upgrades would be handled, and the between-level dialogue. It was interesting just how many decisions have to be made when implementing even simple things like the dialogue, and it can feel like it continues to fractalize into more and more decisions forever. So there's going to be some dialogue here. Okay, when does it show? What's being said? Is it relevant to the player? How is it represented visually? Can you skip it? Is it voiced? Is it funny? Is it unique every time? To stop spiraling for a moment, the cow head was a lot of fun to work on. I drew it up from many different angles and with a solid idea of how I wanted it to look in-game. I also made an animated mock-up to fully illustrate how I imagined it. The mock-up was sort of a best case scenario and I expected it to look quite different in the game, but through the power of Polish computers, it's basically one-to-one. You drop it, it bounces a few times and swaps frames randomly and then comes to a rest and turns into a cloud. Doskonale! After that, I made the final version of the map, which was pretty enjoyable. It took ages, but it was kinda relaxing to just zone out and watch the grass grow. I felt like I learned a lot by experimenting with these radioactive looking trees. Not long after that, Postal had menus up and running, as well as multiple paths for the protesters to follow. This was for when the blockade was introduced in a later section of the game, causing them to pass under the bridge and appear out the other side. A small note of detail, in the final version, they even shrink slightly while they do this to indicate their descent into the ditch. I finally got my first chance to actually play the game, and I was quite excited. I'd seen plenty of footage, but actually experiencing it firsthand and getting that feedback directly was sick. It was sick. With the remaining days absolutely evaporating, it was time to knuckle down. Sound effects were next. Gunshots, partial voice lines, death shouts, UI clicks, and more were compiled, labeled in a spreadsheet, and eventually implemented into the game. Most were taken from Postal 1 and 2, as they're fairly iconic and fit quite well, but there was some taken from Creative Commons sites and sound packs. The original machine gun sound was thankfully changed because this would have gotten really fucking annoying. Protesters also have one death sound effect that only has a 1 in 500 chance of occurring. Having sound in the game made a huge difference, and during development, it really helped everything feel more complete. After a few days, protesters had Kevlar variants and death animations. Each level had a simple transition card similar to Postal 2, as well as an altered version for the endless mode. The main menu had a mocked up placeholder, tower units had been cleaned up and finalized, and the in-game UI was also finalized. I spent way too long making this cowhead button, and I made 2 versions of it before eventually just blending them together with transparency. With a new confidence in art, I stepped up to the plate and started making Vince Desi's portrait for the dialogue. But pride comes before the fall. And that's why it looks like this in the game. Faces are hard, and I don't actually know what I'm doing. Quite frankly, I would have used this placeholder before any of these monstrosities. Back in the Unity shit dimension, changing the game's resolution now worked, though it stays locked to 16:9. Volume sliders were added, and little quality of life changes were made. Small things that you wouldn't think about unless they weren't present, like being able to cancel out of buying a tower. There was one big question looming over us at this point. How do we actually end the game? The only reasonable conclusion was to have a boss fight. But against whom? Mad Cow Mike J? Nah. Terrorists? Suitably ironic, but a little played out. Ultimately, we went with a throwback to someone who labeled Postal as one of the 3 worst things in American society, along with Marilyn Manson and Calvin Klein underwear ads. Introducing the ghost of censorship, former Senator Joe Lieberman.
This is a handgun.
I hadn't realized until actually writing this script that there's an achievement in Postal 2 for killing all the protesters called Lieberman is our leader, so it could not have worked out better. His dialogue could have had more thought put into it, but this phrase has become a bit of an in-joke between Postal and I. Besides, I think the absurdity of it all is funny enough. If you're wondering why the body looks familiar, it's from this frame of SpongeBob, and then I added the head and hand from his Senate hearing about banning violent video games in 1993. Something cool that happens when this fight starts is the blockade being destroyed as the arcade machines explode in a fireball, but you can barely see it because the health bar is in the way. The next major thing was overhauling the menus. The buttons were moved around and given a shiny new look, the background was redone, the 2 picket signs for the title were drawn up, and the settings were all customized, including the sliders and adding small changes to the drop-down menu. Something that was evidently missing by this stage was music. I felt it was too close to the deadline and mostly unnecessary to have anything looping throughout the whole game, but the main menu and the final boss fight should have some kind of score. Even though there's plenty of excellent free music online, I dove into my ancient archive and went through a whole bunch of old music I made in Guitar Pro 5. Some tracks are well over 10 years old and completely untouched, and even though most are just little ideas or completely over the fucking top, I felt the 2 I used were fitting enough to include. While I was working on the assets and a visual mock-up of the final scene, Postal was implementing the developer art mode, an extra feature unlockable after completing the game, as well as this nifty stat tracker. It's hard to convey seeing screenshots of the game you're making in its earliest stages alongside the state it's currently in after so much has been added. Direct comparison is probably what it's like to watch your children grow up, except this is way cooler. The final submission date was right around the corner, and while anxiety-inducing, there was a light at the end of the tunnel for development. Everything major had been implemented, there was only a few graphics left to make, and we were confident we would have the game finished ahead of schedule. The Jam page was slowly being populated with games, and it was exciting to check them out and see what other people had been hard at work on. The Endless mode was the final major hurdle for the code. After a couple of grueling days, it was ready for playtesting, and while fun, would need a little bit more balancing. While that was being finalized, I made the intro presentation graphic and then drafted a few concepts for the game over image. I did want to create them all in full, but burnout for the project had well and truly set in by this point, so this was the only one to make it into the final game. Please do not pay any attention to the absolutely fucked up proportions that these guys have. I did at least fix the vampire mouth that this guy had before. All throughout development, in every one of the game's many builds, there had been a bug in the pathfinding where a protester would start going off track for a moment before correcting. We'd had a few theories along the way that it might be related to the speed buff, the bridge, or a combination of the two, but we could never replicate it or figure out what was causing it. It certainly wasn't anything game-breaking, and it wouldn't really affect the gameplay if it wasn't fixed, but it was frustrating that it was constant and elusive. Then, one evening, I noticed it happen right after I alt-tabbed back to the game window, and suddenly it all became clear. That slight interruption to the game logic when changing focus was causing strife to the unit's pathfinding. It caused them to overshoot their movement target while turning and go off course. It was replicable, it was addressable. This bug that had plagued us for weeks was fixed literally one day before submission. The game now pauses when you tab out. And with that, the game was done. The last bit of spare time was spent setting up external stuff like the itch.io page, community posts, and searching for bugs and exploits. With 3 days and 13 hours to spare, the final version of the game as well as the trailer went live. It was a massive relief, but also a very uneasy feeling. It's hard to shake the sense that you forgot something, or that any second someone is going to report back that the whole game is broken. But thankfully that wasn't the case, and it was all smooth sailing. In conclusion, making a game is hard but not impossible. If you were looking for an excuse to start that project you've always dreamed of, this is your call to action. This is also a call to action. Like the video now. Postal also made a making of video, which you should definitely check out. A huge thanks to all the members of this channel that stay winning. I hope everyone that played the game enjoyed it. I hope this was an interesting look into game development, and yeah, thanks for watching.